Good morning and no, good afternoon, and thank you for joining everyone. And on this webinar by Margaret Winchcombe, entitled "What Regulation is Needed to Make e-scooters Safe?" This presentation is part of the IMechE Automotive Division calendar of events. As the automotive division, our primary activities revolve around knowledge transfer and the organization of events relating not only to cars, but also any other form of road-going transport. We organize virtual events like this one, as well as physical ones, mostly across the UK, but also abroad. We organize both free and paid for events, and these can be found in the IMechE website events section. Now about e-scooters. So e-scooters are a particular hot topic as this new mode of transport has emerged. It's also sometimes divisive form of transport, and we look forward to hearing your questions and input after the presentation. The safety and legality of e-scooters has sparked up many debates. So I'm really excited about this talk and the Q&A that will follow. During the presentation, please use the chat box section to submit any questions that Margaret can reply to at the end of the event. But these can be submitted live during the event. So, well, without further ado, I will hand over to Margaret Winchcombe and to introduce herself and to tell us more about e-scooters and their regulation.
Thank you very much indeed, Fred. Yes, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Here's the presentation. So yes, I'm Margaret Winchcombe, the Deputy Executive Director at PACTS. It's a real pleasure to come to speak to you at this IMechE event. I'm a chartered civil engineer, so I'm familiar with the ICE just up the road from IMechE. And IMechE is an institution which PACTS has had a long association with. Most recently, back at the end of 2019, we presented a joint event on rail safety, and then more recently attended the event that you hosted on powered two-wheelers. So thank you for this opportunity to speak, and with the wonders of technology, we're spread across the country, not stuck down in central London, and possibly even beyond the waters of UK as well. So firstly, an introduction to PACTS. We're the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety. We've been working for over 40 years informing the House of Commons and the House of Lords on air, rail and road safety issues, although most of our time is spent on road safety. Barry Shearman MP was one of our founders. He's the longest serving Labour MP and he's now President of PACTS. And Sir Peter Bottomley, the father of the House, long serving Conservative member, is also a member of PACTS and now chairs our all-party parliamentary group for transport safety. That's a body which is made up of representatives from House of Lords and House of Commons. We meet regularly and have a website if you'd like to look for that. PACTS itself is not a statutory body. The House of Lords and House of Commons don't have to listen to us, but we certainly hope that they will. And over the 40 years, there are many recommendations that we've made which have been adopted. Most recently, we're excited about the Road Safety Investigation Branch, which government announced would be formed earlier this year. That's a recommendation that PACTS had made and brought together members of PACTS itself and of the House of Commons and Lords to support that. Last year, we actually celebrated our 40th anniversary and it gave us an opportunity to fresh our vision. So that is one of a transport system free from death and serious injury where everyone feels safe. Well, what sort of a challenge have we set ourselves with that ultimate vision that we'd like to achieve? Let's start at the very beginning of the long story of road traffic collisions in particular. They're nothing new. The first fatality on a road involving a motor vehicle in the UK was of a pedestrian. This is Bridget Driscoll, who died in 1896. Official fatalities were then recorded in Great Britain since the late 1940s, and it's quite likely that of those official records, we're likely to pass the 500,000 mark of fatalities this September when the next official results are published. Road fatalities are endemic across the world. Globally, 1.3 million people die each year, and of course there are many more who are seriously injured and have life-changing injuries from that. In fact, road traffic collisions are responsible for the leading cause of deaths for 5 to 29-year-olds across the world. But this presentation is focusing on one particular type of road traffic, motor vehicle and road traffic collision. And it was on the 12th of July 2019 that a particular incident came to prominence in the UK. That was the day when a young woman, a TV presenter and influencer, Emily Hartridge, who was travelling on a gift given to her by her boyfriend, a new motor vehicle, a private e-scooter, lost her life. She was riding along a road in central London, fell from the e-scooter, was hit by a lorry and tragically killed. Private e-scooters were then, and still are, illegal to use on public roads and in public places in the UK. And why is that? Well, it's because e-scooters are defined as motor vehicles, but they don't meet the necessary performance criteria for either construction or use to use on public roads. Public can purchase private e-scooters, and now, since July 2020, can legally use government-regulated trial scheme e-scooters in approximately 30 areas in England. That means there are about 20 to 23,000 in operation. And in order to use one of those rental e-scooters, both the e-scooter itself and the rider have to meet various criteria. So, for example, the e-scooter has to meet braking tests, stability, and the rider has to have at a minimum a provisional license. Many places require the rider to be 18 years or older. The operators themselves have control over where the e-scooters are used using geofenced technology, and they have means through identification from members of the public and through their technology of seeing how riders use the e-scooters as well. But these rental e-scooters are only actually accessible to a very small percentage of the population, especially in Great Britain as a whole, let alone in England, the only area where they are legally used. A number of you on the call today might have rental e-scooters in your area, actually where you live. I hazard a guess that for the rest of you who fall outside a rental scheme area, that you will have seen someone riding a private e-scooter, therefore riding an e-scooter illegally in your area. But just how far are these private e-scooters being used? Well, the estimate is that over 1 million private e-scooters could be in use at the moment. This has been based on more recent government surveys that are part of the Transport and Technology Tracker. They estimate that 2% of adults in England, equivalent to about 1 million people aged 16 or over, owned an e-scooter as of last year. With a confidence interval of 95%, that could be up to 1.3 million people, which is interesting because that's not far off the total number of private e-scooters that have been imported. And this is some calculations that PACTS have done with the Bicycle Association helping us as well to look at imports under a specific trade code. Obviously, some of these machines will fall out of use because at least the early models tended to be relatively basic in construction and didn't last long on our modern roads. As we can see that despite being illegal to use, people have really jumped at the opportunity to use an alternative means of transport. And although sales are lower than they were in the peak years, 21, early 22, it hasn't dropped away completely. The government are monitoring the rental e-scooters, as I'll speak about a little later, but they haven't yet published any specific assessment of private e-scooter use. And that's where back in 2020, PACTS anticipated that and sought to fill a gap. So we have been funded by the Road Safety Trust on 3 different projects. This portfolio of work has been built up working with academics, medical professionals, representatives from other charities, and others who have been project partners. So, as I will speak about later on in this presentation, the safety of private e-scooters, the presentation is based on publication of 3 reports where we looked at the construction and use of private e-scooters, trying to fill the space which we still see the government haven't filled with any published documentation. And then most recently, and due to be published by the end of this year, we've been looking at the number of casualties involved in collisions involving e-scooters and comparing that to other modes of transport, trying to understand the extent of underreporting of e-scooters relative to other modes. But again, this presentation is most interested in regulations, and so I'll be referring back to the recommendations that we made back in March 22 for the safety of private e-scooter use and construction. Let's go back again and think about this in the context of safety. So we want to understand at PACTS how safe are e-scooters relative to other modes of transport. If we consider them in the wider context, as an earlier slide showed, the police records, official police records, identify around 1,700 deaths on Great British roads each year. So, as I've alluded to already, there's a long way for us to go to meet Vision Zero, the ideal of 0 deaths and life-changing injuries on our roads. Most people who do die on roads are more likely to be killed in a car or by a car than any other mode, and they are the predominant modes of transport. But if we were to look at active travel modes, pedestrians and cyclists, they're very rarely involved in collisions that result in the death of another road user. So we could classify that using the definitions on the slide as the mode of transport which is low danger is cycling and pedestrians. People travelling by bus are in the least hazardous form of transport, who are least likely to or rarely killed while travelling as a bus passenger. We want to understand, where do e-scooters fit into this? How hazardous are they to someone riding one, and what risk do they pose to other riders, to other road users as they're in use on our roads? So let's have a look at some of the figures we've got already. Well, to date, 34 people have died since 2019 in collisions involving e-scooters on roads in Great Britain. The youngest was 14, the eldest was 74. The eldest person was a pedestrian, the one pedestrian who's been killed by an e-scooter. All but 3 collisions involve someone riding a private e-scooter. So the vast majority are people riding private e-scooters. We've now got official data published by the DFT from police records for 3 years. So those figures are up on the screen now. It's taken a while for the official records to include e-scooters because there's no specific category on the forms that they used to include e-scooters. Instead, free text has to be used. As of the end of November this year, then there will be a specific category within what's called the crash method and of recording. And from next year, then it will be across Great Britain. There'll be a specific category for e-scooters for police to record. But we know that under-recording is evident with other modes of transport, and so these are good figures for us to rely on. So let's dig down a little bit deeper to try and understand more about this hazard and danger of e-scooters. For pretty much the same across all 3 years, around 20% of casualties involved in collisions with e-scooters have been other vulnerable road users. So e-scooters are causing a danger to other road users. They're also a hazard to the riders. 30% of e-scooter users and other vulnerable road users have suffered serious injuries, and that's higher than the 20% of serious injuries suffered by all casualties from road traffic collisions across Great Britain last year. The serious injuries have been dug into more deeply by the DFT, and PACTS similarly have been working through information from what's called TARN, that's the Trauma Audit Research Network to understand whether this is a realistic picture of serious injuries, and found that 60% of those people suffering serious injuries to fall into the category of TARN, being in hospital for over 3 days and meeting other various criteria as well, 30% of those are linked in the official data, which is similar to pedal cyclists. So we think that this information is representative of e-scooter collision riders. It is likely that incidents will occur away from the road, where there's no obligation for the public to report to the police, so we will miss some of that information. And obviously there's the big question that overrides all of this is, if you are riding an e-scooter illegally on the road, how likely are you going to want to report a collision involving an e-scooter when you are then liable as the rider for a fine, points on your licence, because you would not be riding with insurance, and of course the possibility of your e-scooter being confiscated. Is there any opportunity for this unsatisfactory situation that we find ourselves in the UK changing? Well, let's have a look at where we are with the government so far. Back in 2019, Emily died when she was using a private e-scooter. They were the only ones that were available for use on the roads then. We then had the trial starting in the midst of a pandemic, when a mode of transport that could provide an alternative to predominantly public transport could be made available. So the e-scooter trials were rushed out onto the roads. The Transport Select Committee responded relatively quickly with a report. They noted that if e-scooters were to be legalised, then it was important for pavements to be kept clear of them. So pavements could be either preserved for pedestrians, and that e-scooter use should not undermine walking and cycling. So active modes of transport shouldn't be undermined. Instead, people should be moving away from private motor vehicle travel, as in car travel, to use an e-scooter instead. Well, there was some silence, and then April 2020, Mark Shapps spoke to the Transport Select Committee, suggesting there would be legislation coming forward with various technological advances in as well, further geofencing details which might respond to the concerns which the Transport Select Committee had spoken to earlier in their report. We then had the last Queen's speech in May, and a transport bill was proposed. Baroness Veer was very clear, saying that safety would be at the heart of their plans to create a regulatory framework for smaller, lighter, zero-emission vehicles, and e-scooters were the form of transport that they would be honing in on first. Well, since then, we've had somewhat of a hiatus, and a new administration and their approach to transport differs noticeably. So this presentation is one which I may have wished now to be able to talk about regulations that were in place already. We're not there yet. We still have the opportunity to comment on how the regulations could be. Let's see, what regulations should there be in place as and when e-scooters, if and when private e-scooters are legalised. Well, there are 4 elements that we need to consider: the safety of them as in their construction, the use of them, and then what can we learn from regulations that have already been put in place elsewhere? And number 4, what can we learn from the regulated e-scooters that we have in place in the UK already, so those rental e-scooters? Overarching all of this, the regulations that we propose have safety as their priority, and PACTS work to present regulations which are based on evidence, are clear, practical, and readily enforceable. And we look for regulations that fit in, if they're prioritising safety, into safe system. So this is the best practice approach for preventing deaths and serious injuries on the road. It's something which was produced in Sweden in the 1990s. It's been adopted there and elsewhere on national and local levels. So, for example, the Scottish Road Safety Framework to 2030, that's based on Safe System and Vision Zero. The Welsh Road Safety Framework is due out later this year. We expect it will be based on the same. And then various local authorities in England have adopted Vision Zero based on Safe System, for example, Leeds, London and Essex. I think this is a really useful presentation of Safe System in the fact that it works as a wheel. So its aim is to prevent deaths and serious injuries on our roads, and it recognises that to reach that, there is responsibility for many different elements. People will make mistakes as they are carrying out their responsibilities for any of these parts, but by working together with a sort of Swiss cheese model, the aim is to manage the magnitude of the crash forces on the human body and remove the potential for death or serious injury. And those different sort of Swiss cheese slices relate to the speed, the road design, vehicle design, road use behaviour, and the post-crash response, which can be a combination of both the emergency services, but also the longer term investigation of what happened in the incident where there were casualties. And this is applicable to all needs, all road users, regardless of how they're travelling. So with that in mind, let's see how Safe System could be applied to a private e-scooter. Emily Hartridge was riding on an early generation private e-scooter in 2019. Its steering column was vertical in relation to the deck that she was standing on, and its wheels were 8 inches diameter. They were also pneumatic tyres, and her front wheel was under-inflated. The vehicle design, thinking of it as one of the Safe System pillars, wasn't optimised for safe use on public roads. So what improvements could there be? Well, e-scooter operators in particular have demonstrated how wheel size is vital. So I think we're on to version 6, possibly of tier, at least version 5 of the Voi e-scooters. And their e-scooters have now increased their front wheel size up to 12 inches. The rear wheel size varies. This change is supported not just from the sort of live experiment on our roads, but also from research laboratories and academic institutions who've studied e-scooters with different wheel size and found stability increases with wheel size. The smaller wheel size makes it harder to navigate changes in the road surface, but also that's inevitably understanding with sort of bumps, but it also impacts on their stability when accelerating and braking. So the larger the wheel, the more stability there is at sort of both ends of your start and stop of a journey. And then the other element of safe e-scooter design, which we have listed here, impact on the safety performance, not just for the rider, but for other road users as well. So lighting, making them more visible, particularly since they are a very slender form of transport on our roads, and the maximum unladen weight important, because if they're in the event of the collision, the smaller the mass, the less energy that's dissipated. And what about speeds? Well, some of the private e-scooters that it's possible to purchase go up to in excess of 60 miles an hour. Emily herself in July 2019 was approaching a roundabout, and she was travelling parallel to a heavy goods vehicle. The tachograph analysis within that placed it going 15 miles an hour. So that means that as she was approaching the roundabout, Emily was going at the maximum speed of the e-scooter she was on. 15 miles an hour isn't unusual for an e-scooter. In fact, the maximum speed set for all the rental trials is 15.5. Interestingly, a majority of the rental trials are run at 12.5 miles an hour. It's possible for e-scooters, private e-scooters, to be modified to travel at significantly faster speeds than the 15 miles an hour that Emily's was travelling at. And Imperial College have carried out computational modelling, comparing the wheel size as well as speeds, and found in testing of an e-scooter, not in collision with another vehicle, but travelling along a surface itself, found that by reducing the speed of the e-scooter from 20 to 12 miles an hour, it led to a 14% reduction in the impact speed and 12% reduction in the impact force. Studies have also been carried out on the impact of speed on a collision with a pedestrian. Although the data isn't published, the understandable result is reducing in speed results in a reduction in impact on the pedestrian. The jury's still out on what severity of those injuries would be. Interestingly, the speeds which are set in various European countries are capped at 12.5 miles an hour. So that's lower than the rental speeds that we have in the UK. Now, of course, if we put forward the proposal of 12.5 miles an hour, we also recommend there to be anti-tampering mechanisms included in the construction of e-scooter, and this that tampering should be prohibited by law. So looking at another element, safe user behaviour, another element of the safe system. When Emily Hartridge set out on her journey, she made a conscious decision to wear a cycle helmet. Tragically, the injuries she sustained from the collision with the lorry were so significant that she didn't survive. But helmets are really important because trauma surgeons have published data which shows that e-scooter casualties are suffering more injuries which are more similar to motorcyclists than to pedal cyclists. Head injuries are common because of the mechanism that e-scooter riders take when they fall from an e-scooter. They tend to fall forwards over the handlebars, and that's demonstrated with the number of facial injuries which medics are treating. Research, again carried out by Imperial, have shown that a standard cycle helmet isn't best designed to protect a rider if they were to fall from an e-scooter. So an optimum design for a e-scooter helmet is still needed. And studies from Germany, Denmark and Sweden have found that it's up to 50% of people are suffering head injuries. And then the governments in those countries have responded. So helmet wearing is now mandatory in a number of countries in mainland Europe. E-scooter riders should be old enough to understand the rules of the road. As I've explained already, if you want to use a rental e-scooter, then you need to have at a minimum a provisional driving licence. Some of the local authorities have moved beyond that and asked for full driving licence and for riders to be at least 18 years old. That's because e-scooters are motor vehicles, and riders should understand the responsibilities of that. Therefore, we recommend to face the penalties for drink driving, dangerous driving, careless driving, etc. How about safe roads and roadsides? Well, Emily's approach to the Queen's Road roundabout in Battersea was along a cycle lane. So there was some segregated infrastructure in place. However, it was just a line marked on the surface of the road, and it was well used. And a pedal cyclist who was coming behind Emily witnessed how it was when she was riding over a recessed metal inspection cover that she lost stability and fell. Covers like that are fairly minor and a common hazard in our urban areas. And of course, we know that potholes and road scarring are inevitable and extensive in our road landscape. The design of an e-scooter, as spoken to under safe vehicles, needs to account for the changes in the road surface. But in the context of a roadscape where there are vehicles of significantly varying sizes, e-scooters are on the vulnerable end. They are vulnerable road users. They haven't got the protection of a frame of a vehicle, and so are susceptible to injuries. And of course, they're not alone. People who are on pedal cycles and or motorcycles also face vulnerability relative to other modes. So in the context of safe system and with other vulnerable road users in mind, PACTS would recommend e-scooters being segregated from those who are travelling significantly slower than them, so to be segregated from pedestrians, but then also segregated from vehicles which are more dangerous than them because they are faster and heavier. Where there is a gap is what research is needed into how e-scooters integrate with pedal cyclists. And as we're in a phase of time where there is significant evolution in modes of transport, e-scooters just being one of them, there's going to be an interesting debate on where do we place these various different types of vulnerable road user into particularly our urban landscapes. So I said that we would travel through a safe system and then have a look at lessons that we might learn from elsewhere. Looking to Europe in particular, so e-scooters have been in use there for longer than in the UK. Regulations have been in place for the vast majority of countries, Ireland and the Netherlands being exceptions which don't yet have regulations fully in place. So regulations have been in existence in mainland Europe, but there's not yet one Europe-wide standard. That's a gap which is being filled with research at the moment. I have no idea when the date of that will be finalised. But in the meantime, different countries are drawing up amendments to regulations over the last 5 years as their understanding has evolved. So, for example, although some countries have an age limit of 14, in Belgium the limit is 16. 16 is proposed for Netherlands regulations. Speeds limits have dropped. So there's now 12.5 mile an hour limit in various countries, including Germany and Italy. At least 12 countries have compulsory helmet wearing requirements, either for children, that's under 18s, or for all adults. And that's based on the evidence of head injuries. Sweden and Denmark, for example, and I think recently Italy also have helmet wearing. Insurance is required in some countries, including Germany. Germany is a country that's cited as being the gold standard of e-scooter regulation. However, regulation in place without maybe the necessarily enforcement, although more investigation is needed, doesn't mean that there are no injuries. Significantly, German data from earlier this year showed that 30% of injuries incurred in e-scooters collisions were from single vehicle collisions. So that's someone falling from an e-scooter without being hit by another vehicle, and that half of the fatalities have been single vehicle collisions. Intoxication is a problem, with 35% of e-scooter casualties being intoxicated in data from Germany as well. There's a lot to learn from mainland Europe. Some things we see on the news, like the Paris ban on rental e-scooters that was voted through a referendum back in April and came into action beginning of this month. That will make a difference, no doubt, on removing the stationary pavement clutter, but the sale of private e-scooters in Paris and France has been significant. There was a 42% increase, in fact, last year. So e-scooters which are private and rental may differ in the controls that the local authorities have to some extent, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily are able to manage the moving risk which e-scooters pose as they're used as a mode of transport. Here in the UK, we've got lessons we can learn from the regulated rental trials. A report was published in December last year, which covered the first 18 months of the trials. So we know from that in those first 18 months, nearly 15 million rides were made by nearly 1.5 million users. We know that in that same period of time, 800, well, nearly 1 million private e-scooters were brought into the UK. For the operator-managed rental e-scooters, we know that there are government regulations for their construction. We know that there are limits on their speed, and we know that they're maintained by the operator. That maintenance by the operator does lend itself to useful safety features, like, for example, bans at night, where intoxicated use might be more likely. And interestingly, during the Cheltenham Gold Cup, all e-scooters in the rental schemes were taken off the roads to manage safety. There are some which are being closed. And interestingly, there seem to be little public campaigns for reinstatement of rental e-scooter schemes when they've been taken away from areas. Returning to the evaluation itself, what have we actually learned? Well, disappointingly for us at PACTS, there was very little information on the safety of rental e-scooter use. There was lots of information about people transferring modes to use a rental e-scooter and how they felt about using an e-scooter, but being a evidence-driven, a charity that's based on evidence-driven, data-driven evidence, we were disappointed that they had collected data from only 6 of the 30 trial areas, and found that in that information, so this is based on police data for 6 trial areas, they had found that the rate of injury to an e-scooter rider was about 3 times that of a pedal cyclist. The rate is something which is a really important measure to understand how likely somebody is to be involved in a collision, depending on the distance which they've travelled. The rental e-scooters provided us with a great opportunity to understand this, because every e-scooter journey, the distance travelled is known, and the operators also hold information about the rider. PACTS itself has written to the DFT asking for more information to be gathered from the trials, which are going to be continuing until May 24. So there is still opportunity for further information to be gained from those rental trials. People may wish to raise questions about mode shift, which we can speak about later. I think the important thing that we can draw out from the evaluation of the rental trials is that when people are choosing to use a rental trial in place of walking, cycling, or public transport, which I spoke to earlier, are less dangerous forms of transport, to using an e-scooter, it has an exposure both to their the risk of harm to themselves and the danger they pose to other people. So mode shift is not just about the carbon emission reductions, it's also about the safety, the danger, and the hazards which e-scooters cause. So where next? Well, the DFT have, and followed up by ministers in written questions, have said there will be public consultations. So if listeners wish to put their tuppence forward in what regulations for e-scooters could include, then two public consultations are due out later this year. Two, because one would cover rental e-scooters and the other would be for private e-scooters. There has been resumption of conversations in the sort of void after the last hiatus with ministers who are giving indications that there will be some means of legislation put forward, and we're really encouraged by the opportunity for consultation, because that would inform what legislation would be put forward. It's unlikely that we're going to have a transport bill. We're into conference season now. Time is running out. General election is approaching. I have no special insider knowledge, but we're not expecting there to be a transport bill of any significance coming through before the next general election. We do know that a consortium of TRL and Warwick Manufacturing Group, that's based at Warwick University, have been commissioned to carry out research into safety and also accessibility and sustainability of e-scooters. PACTS sits on the advisory board for that. And there is an indication that the outcome from that research will inform any regulations if they come about, which could possibly be through some secondary legislation. Whatever it is, we do have the fixed date of the 31st of May 24 for when the rental trials will end. There's no indication that legislation will be in place by then, but that is a date by which time the rental trials either need to cease or need to be given some form of legislation to extend, as has already been done 3 times. So it's possible that will just be an extension of the trials rather than extension of rentals in general. Of course, simultaneously, private e-scooters continue to be available for purchase and are actively being used on our streets. It's no doubt that when the full casualty data from the DFT is published in September, the end of this month, that there will be confirmation of the number of people who have been injured in private e-scooter collisions, both riders themselves and other road users, riders involved in collisions where they were on their own, and riders who have been involved in collisions with other road users. So, in conclusion, it's likely that there are well over 30 times as many private e-scooters in use in the UK as there are rental e-scooters. And while these private e-scooters continue to be readily available to purchase, people continue to buy them. Some people see e-scooters as being the answer to reaching zero carbon emissions. But if someone's riding an e-scooter instead of walking or cycling, it's likely to increase the risk of harm to themselves and the risk of danger to others, and that moves away from the vision zero deaths and life-changing injuries, the vision that PACTS has. The evaluation of the rental e-scooters provided some information into this understanding. It was sparse, but what it did show was the increased risk of harm to an e-scooter rider in comparison to if they were a pedal cyclist. Any legislation is still some time off. In the meantime, regulations are being drawn up with research from institutions and organisations, which has been commissioned by the DfT, and that's due to be published spring next year. In the meantime, PACTS continue speaking to the DfT about the regulations as we have them laid out in this presentation, and we recommend that when a consultation is held, that the responses bear in mind those regulation recommendations that we've made, and consider e-scooters in the whole, their use and also their construction. And in the meantime, while we wait for direction from those above, more needs to be made clear to the public of the risks of riding e-scooters illegally, and tragically from the experience in Birmingham at the end of last year, the importance of following the regulations which are in place for the rental e-scooters. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. If you don't have time for your question to be answered today, then my email is here on the screen now. I'd be pleased to receive questions and would have a go at responding where possible. Thank you very much.
Well, Margaret, thank you very much for this excellent and really informative presentation. And we have been receiving some questions online. Please keep sending them through. As I'm sure you all agree, this the safety and legality of e-scooters is often divisive and sparks up many debates. So I'm really excited about this Q&A. So the first question here for you, Margaret, is controversial. So is there much point in new regulations, since the present regulations are widely ignored and rarely enforced? Similarly for e-bikes.
Sorry, I missed the first bit of that.
The questioning whether there is much point in regulations because they're rarely enforced, or perhaps
Yes.
not sufficiently enforced. So I don't know if there is work being done on the enforcement side.
It does feel very much as though the police have been given the heavy load to carry, and that's an issue on 2 points. One, that they already have a lot of work to do, and as PACTS has reported in our wider work on road safety, the priority of roads policing has really dropped away, and the number of road police people on the streets is, I think it's a third that it was 10, 15 years ago. Really encouraging to see that the just strategy for policing that was published earlier this year does include road safety and roads policing as a priority. So that means that there is more impetus for police and crime commissioners and police chiefs to put more money into policing, and that obviously could in part be to criminal activity, so illegal use of e-scooters, but then also the assessment of collisions after they have happened, and where e-scooters have been included in a collision or other modes of illegal vehicle, there'll be more data. Now, I really appreciate that that's a long-term thing. It's not an immediate answer, and yes, it is immensely frustrating. And we know some police forces have actively chosen to work both ways. Liverpool, very active to remove them from the roads and crush them, no questions asked. Others, Cambridgeshire, for example, where they will only intervene if the vehicle is evidently being used dangerously. And then on the sales side, there are limits on what can be stopped, as in the e-scooters are legal to sell, so they are being seized by trading standards when they are evidently unsafe, as in you could get your finger trapped in them, or the electrical components aren't safe. And we know that sadly, dangerous electric equipment can cause fires, and we've had fatalities there, almost as many as we've had on the roads.
On that note, Margaret, I have a question myself. So I'm wondering if you have data on what percentage of e-scooters on the market comply to the recommended specifications.
Now, that's a really fascinating question, and one that we would really very much like to know. I hazard a guess that many do meet the 15 miles an hour limit, which is the requirement of the rental e-scooters, but it is evident that so many of them can be tampered and are tampered with. We don't know enough about what's actually out on the streets to really answer that question.
That's really interesting. I have a question from Alexander. Now, have you compared the accident rates to rental bicycles rather than to all bicycle users, as this may be a little bit unfair or not like for like?
So this is a great question, and yes, lots of people have been asking it, and we ourselves, and in order to get the pieces together, we need to have the right reporting mechanisms in place. So it's really encouraging that the crash system, so this is a method of recording which produces data results more quickly in police records, that from November will include means for recording different types of micromobility. So then we would be able to get the rental e-scooter data. We found it really difficult to get data out of operators because understandably they have a commercial interest. And while we have areas, London being an exception where they have 3 different operators, where we have areas where there's only 1 operator, it's difficult to compare like with like. Ultimately, in the long term, once this crash data is more accessible, we would really like to compare the rates of rental e-scooters and rental bikes. And as and when we can measure distance travelled by private modes, them as well.
There are more questions on this topic, actually. And I suppose the type of users for e-scooters is often very specific, as you were saying. A lot of users were intoxicated in crashes. So it may be they may be used more for recreational purposes than standard bicycles.
Yes, I think we are very fortunate in the UK to have had the evaluation of the rental e-scooters. It's just a shame that that has not continued throughout the whole of the trials. Some local authorities are carrying out more research. Nationally, it's really dropping away. So yes, it would be fascinating to really understand. Now we're 3 years on from when the trials began. Is it still recreation, or are these getting more embedded into the daily commute, and are people really giving up a private motor vehicle in place? Or are they just embedding them into, I'll save myself a few minutes because I'll go on an e-scooter rather than walking?
I have a question here from Chris Enderby of Allianz. I think you said essentially e-scooters are 3 times more dangerous than pedal cycling. As this is based on rental e-scooters that are speed and age regulated, do we understand why this is the case and what we could do to reduce it to parity?
Yes, a big question, and I do always have to be very careful about exactly how I use those figures from the trial. So that figure was based on 6 areas of the rental trials where the police forces had provided sufficient data that the SATS team felt that they could could carry out the calculation. So it's a very small area. It's not the whole of the UK. How could parity be achieved? Well, I've just spoken about how the construction, for example, of an e-scooter could be amended to increase its safety. Slightly amusingly, researchers in Singapore have carried out detailed computational modelling of this and found that the closer a e-scooter resembles a pedal cycle, the safer it is. So slightly joke answer, when e-scooters look like pedal cycles, then we'll have parity. I'm sorry, it's not more constructive than that.
Now I have a question from Barry Tan, RSSB Vehicle Dynamics Engineer. What are your thoughts on regulation of e-scooters with regards to their batteries? This can relate to public charging facilities, private charging at home, or when they are congregated at areas such as parking at train stations, or when they are carried on board trains, for example. This primarily relates to the risk of fire, start, sustenance, spread, and control.
Yes. So PACTS as ourselves, we focus mostly on in use. We're very much aware of the regulation for e-scooter batteries. I'd really recommend the questioner goes to the Bicycle Association website and has a look there, because they're very clear about the requirements. There's no doubt that if regulations were in place for limiting tampering of e-scooters, because in PACTS priorities, speed could be limited and couldn't be tampered with, then that could be brought in with prevention of tampering to batteries as well.
Great. I have another different line of question from Simone Selby. Apologies for pronunciation. It's whether regulations will be made to also cover e-skateboards. Have these been considered?
So it's unlikely that e-skateboards and similarly univheels and monowheels and unicycles will be included, primarily because there's no active control of braking. So I don't anticipate vehicles which are controlled purely by your feet to be legalised for use. The work that TRL and Warwick Manufacturing Group are carrying out at the moment, one of their jobs is to try and define specifically what light electric low speed vehicles would be. I expect they would need to have hand controls as well. It means that we could see more variation in small vehicles, so cargo bikes, etc., could be extended, but I don't see the smaller vehicles being legalised soon.
I have a question from Glenn Fry. It's on about the safety of cyclists and how this might be affected. So it's whether the fact that e-scooters sharing cycle lanes but being speed restricted might force cyclists to perhaps use the road more than they do currently, and whether that had been considered in the overall safety recommendations.
So it is really important to consider where they fit in. If we were to look to the Netherlands, where there is greater use of micromobility, they are considering the safe system wheel, and where urban speed limits are reduced to 20 miles an hour, as was adopted in Wales 10 days ago, there, because 20 miles an hour is the limiting speed beyond which, so when vehicles are travelling higher than 20 miles an hour, then the likelihood of a vulnerable road user being killed is significantly higher. So in the Netherlands, they're considering that approach and considering the large variety of vehicles on the roads and the lack of possibility of having e-scooter, pedal cycle, car lanes, etc., and saying if everyone is travelling below this speed, then we will mix everybody in together. So in the UK, I think we need to consider carefully which are the priority policy areas. So a pedal cyclist, genuine pedal cyclist, would sort of gain points on the carbon emissions reduction because they are travelling by mode of transport which is only human powered. An e-scooter isn't, so arguably we need to consider them in a different way. If we are going to have any modes of transport which are vulnerable road users in urban areas on our roads, then we need to be considering the speed limits that we're putting. So if there is anecdotal evidence or data collected by somewhere like Vivacity of e-scooters taking prominence in segregated use and pedal cyclists being moved to a road space, then I would suggest the local authority will probably have a good think at that and wonder where their policy areas, what policy priorities are, and how to address it.
Great, thank you. Question from Robert Timmis. Is saying that every year that the regulation is delayed, is going to sort of further increase the danger to public and to users. So is it in any way possible to speed the process up by deploying regulations used in other countries, or from the rental city schemes?
So absolutely, there is an awful lot that's been learnt from Europe. In fact, the rental regulations that were put together back in early 2020 are based heavily on the German regulations. It's the fact that, as you started this webinar, e-scooters are so contentious. Ultimately, the decision is made by politicians who have their places because they're voted in. And when there's something that's difficult, sometimes it's easier to push that to the side and move to something which they more likely to get votes on. So absolutely, I mean, there are many speakers into the conversation about their frustration that the regulations have been delayed. You know, a member of the public could write to their minister and put forward their views that this really needs to be sorted out. I think we have to continue doing that and be ready, as I said, when the consultation is opened, to respond with clear evidence-based recommendations, so that when the regulation process does open at last, they say, yes, we are going to put primary legislation in place. There are clear pots of information that they're using, which are evidence-based, rather than us starting a cycle again of we need to collect more data, which is then delays things further.
Thank you. And I was wondering, is there any work being done on so safety certification rating for e-scooters, something similar to consumer ratings for vehicles, like the Euro NCAP that everybody knows?
Yes, so at the moment, because private e-scooters are sold basically as toys, they just have to meet 3 different regulations. So CE mark is one of those. Yes, absolutely. Should they be type approved? That's the sort of thing that the TRL WNG discussion needs, research needs to include. The legislators are more reluctant to have that because they think it would impact on accessibility. But we're in a really interesting position with e-scooters and with the development of new forms of other micromobility, electric scooters, which replicate sort of mopeds. At some point, there needs to be some delineation between pedal cycles, which have a privileged position of not needing type approval, and the vehicles which currently we have type approval. How is that gap going to be filled? It's a question up for debate.
And I have a final one about the environmental impact of e-scooters, and if this is being taken into account in the studies, particularly if someone is using an e-scooter instead of walking or cycling.
So yes, this is sort of speaking slightly outside PACTS remit because we're safety, but the evidence that we've collected is in our report from last year is that people are using e-scooters in place of walking and cycling. So therefore there are increased emissions because the vehicle has to be powered. WMG have done some really interesting research into production, so emissions from productions of e-scooters and how are parts moved across the world and where could they be made. And yes, sustainability is part of that remit for this GFT funded work. So we will hear more from them.
Great. Thank you very much, Margaret. Well, the Q&A has clearly exposed how there are many of us really in favor and many of us against electric scooters. So they're clearly the Marmite of transport, as you described it earlier, Margaret. I have A final question. So as the IMechE, we're involved in organizing events, as we discussed earlier, but also in advising and influencing policy. So is there a specific area of focus that you think the IMechE could support in to help improve the safety of e-scooters?
I think please see this in the wider context of e-scooters being one of many evolving modes of transport, and considering in the longer term, if there is going to be legislation, what other parameters you yourself as an institution will set. Our recommendations are that safety is prioritised and new technologies come to our roads to help people get around, but help them get around safely, being least hazardous and least dangerous to other road users as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we haven't been able to go through all the questions, but hopefully we covered the topics that people were mostly asking about. I know you shared your details kindly earlier, Margaret, and please do also share the link to this this webinar when it goes online as a recording to anyone that you think might be interested in the topic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret, and I hope to welcome the attendees and yourself to many of our future events. Thank you very much.